So what's interesting to note is that President Eisenhower's stance on this kind of continually became more and more in a privatized mindset. So basically, he didn't feel as though governments should have the control or say-so over what couples do behind closed doors. And he looked at contraceptive methods like the progesterone pill as a private choice. It's kind of the same thing as like, if you came home and you're asked your significant other, do you want, Steak and Shake or do you want Chick-fil-A? Like that sort of thing. He was like, well, we shouldn't have the ability to regulate those decisions. And when this progesterone pill was sold, it was initially sold to married women. Now, what's interesting to note is that before that happened, while there were still some states that looked at it as a legal issue for these women to have access to progesterone-based contraception, there was a massive wave of women who started complaining about having menstrual issues and difficulties. When the progesterone pill was going through trials, the reason that the FDA picked it up primarily, because again, you have to think in a lot of states there were laws against you being able to use contraceptive methods like this. For the FDA to approve it and for it to go through trials, it had to be looked at not as something that was primarily used for contraception, but that contraception was a side effect of. And it was initially marketed or kind of on the surface told to be a drug that would help with menstrual issues and difficulties that women would have with their periods. And so when it was first marketed in this way, and there was like a warning label on there that said, side effect, you could have birth issues, you could have, losses in fertility for short periods of time or like this sort of thing. It was contraceptive. That a lot of women just started coming to their doctors and complaining that they were having menstrual problems. It was just like in unprecedented numbers, just all of a sudden as soon as this came out. And you can kind of look at that as though women realized that this was their opportunity to have more choice in birth control, but that they couldn't have it just for what was at the time the side effect. And that's what they wanted to primarily use it for. So they started complaining about having all these other issues just so they would have the opportunity to get on it and use it for its, at the time, secondary side effect purpose, which was, as a contraceptive method. So it was kind of really interesting to notice that how much women's choices sort of played into where this drug went and how it was marketed later on. So you get to the point where birth control pills become pop culture icons. So, for example, there was a premiere of a film called Prudence and the Pill in 1968, which was kind of all about this choice of, I now have the directive in my life, and if I want to sort of circumnavigate going through marriage and all that sort of stuff, and I don't necessarily want to get into that because it's almost 100% likelihood that once I get married, I am going to have kids, and I don't necessarily want to do that. So, but now I've got a choice that I can have relationships that aren't necessarily married relationships. And I can do other things that I find more important, like focusing on careers and that sort of thing. So it becomes kind of a pop culture icon around that same sort of time. There's also an economic boom that happens post-contraceptive pill. Once women could wait to have children and no longer needed a straight shot path to marriage, they kind of quickly entered into the workforce and really added a significant contribution to the economy, which has only since grown in scale. And so let's kind of like break this down a little bit. If you can wait to have children and you're a woman, you're going to go out and, especially around the same time that the sexual revolution is happening, and it's kind of all about, well, it's important for you to be working, it's important for you to be contributing to society, it's more important for you to have financial freedom than anything. You mix those two together, and you get a lot of women that are now entering college in like higher numbers than had ever been seen before, bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, and you have more women that are entering in these jobs that were once prominently dominated by the male part of the workforce and that sort of thing. So you have women entering into the economy, which expands the economy, puts more money in circulation. But then of the women that later on sort of realize that they have to take up a job because if they're going to marry someone, they can no longer rely on that person to be the main provider, because due to things like inflation and also to the fact that now the economy and the workforce has gotten larger, if they want to have kids, they're going to have to work too, which means that they're going to have to, in a lot of cases, employ a tertiary caregiver like a nanny or a daycare or that sort of thing, which then adds a third party into the mix. So now you get to a point in the culture where the vast majority of households not only have one person working, they have three. And so you kind of not only double, but you kind of triple the economy. But that's just sort of like more of the large scale, economical and social aspects. There's also some interesting things that happen in terms of partner preference. So it's not really well documented until years later, but I think that we do have a lot of really old studies on this, dating back to 20, 30 years ago. And then also there's been more recent studies, of course, that look at what happens to your choice in partner once you're on the birth control pill, which is ultimately going to influence the decisions that you make as far as having children, or even how much intimacy that you have with your partner when you're trying to have those children. So typically when women are off birth control, so they're just going by their normal cycle, they tend to prefer more masculine features and cues in their partners. Things like more masculinized faces, more masculinized voices, more masculinized scents, primarily the scent of testosterone. And these tend to change for women that are intervening in their cycle using progesterone-based birth control. And your cycle goes through a fluctuation of two hormones predominantly. So most of the women that are listening to this in the audience are probably already going to know this. But your cycle is controlled by two hormones that vary with respect to each other. And when one is usually high, the other is usually low, and vice versa. So in the part of the cycle where there's high estradiol, your brain is geared more towards sex and intimate encounters and that sort of thing. Your body prepares to release an egg for conception, and women at this point are typically looking for good genetic qualities in a partner to have children with. Later on, the egg is released, those estradiol levels go down, and about 24 hours after the egg is released, progesterone is released, and there's an increased probability of implantation of that egg. And the hormones tend to make you more hungry, lose interest in sexual encounters, and also makes you sleepier. And this is something that most women, experience during the course of their cycle. So this is sort of a cycle that's not regulated by birth control. What birth control tends to do is to sort of cut down on the estradiol levels. So there's not as much estrogen in your system, and it tends to prop up the progesterone levels, which is kind of like puts you in the state where you're always kind of, either tired, or you're always kind of like low on libido, or you're more sort of sleepy, and you don't have as much interest in sex, or even things like music, which is really interesting. So people that get off of birth control find that they have an increased desire to listen to and download and interact with music. But while you're on birth control, while your estradiol levels are kept particularly low, women have been found in many studies to prefer less masculine features. So there's a particular research study that was done where they took a selection of women and they took their partners and they asked them, the primary question was, were you on or off birth control when you met your partner, when you decided to start dating them or what have you? And what they did was they took pictures of the men's faces in all those cases. So some of them maybe were on birth control when they met their partner, some of them were off birth control. And they sorted the faces into two different categories. And they took those and gave it to a independent evaluator that was looking at objective measures in masculinity. So, for example, the height to width ratio of your face. and like the prominence of certain features and this sort of thing, without really knowing, what face was corresponding to what relationship, but just kind of basically saying like, oh, this one's more masculine, this one's less masculine, and those sorts of things. And when the results came back to the institution that was running the study, it was very clear that women who were on birth control tended to look for men that were less masculine in those features, and that women that were off birth control, that were going through regular cycles when they chose their partner, preferred more masculine features.